In recent years, it feels as though some of our favourite car manufacturers have been striving to stay still, working hard without actually moving forwards. The legislators keep ramping up the resistance so that the engineers have to sweat the details, simply to avoid going backwards. I'm talking, of course, about those marques who like a bit of deep breathing, some pure, natural aspiration for their engines. The latest Ferrari 12Cilindri is a case in point. It's named after the engine as a celebration, yet on paper, that engine's performance is not the sort of big leap on we've seen in the past. So, what has changed? And has the effort been worth it? If this film makes your horse prance, then do please think about joining the Hagerty Drivers Club. You get an award-winning magazine and myriad other benefits. To find out more, just click on the link below. For the launch of this latest £336,000 Ferrari, we're not, as you might imagine, in Italy, but instead somewhere a bit smaller and further north in Europe. Welcome to Luxembourg, which is, well, a bit like the UK in terms of its weather, in that it can be lovely bright sunshine one minute like this, or tipping it down with rain the next. It is, however, much more beautiful than I'd perhaps given it credit for before I came here. The roads are immaculate as well. This is a country of some just 600, 700,000 people, and yet it feels like there must have been some sort of clerical error, and they've been given all the budget from their larger neighbour, Germany. But you're not here for the geography, so let's get to the V12 heart of Maranello's latest creation. Open up this big front-hinged clamshell, wonderful bit of theatre which I really like, and it feels so appropriate with this engine. And I love the fact that it's still obviously exposed. We've got the crackle red finish on the cam covers here. I like the fact you can actually see the tyres and into the wheel arches all into the car. It feels special somehow. The numbers. This, to give it a slightly more prosaic name, is the F140 HD engine. 6.5 litres, naturally aspirated V12. And whilst it obviously hasn't changed a huge amount from the 812, it is very much a derivation of that. We do have more power in here. So we've got 819 brake horsepower, 30 brake horsepower up on the 812 Superfast, and it produces that at 9,250 RPM. It will rev all the way to 9.5, which is 600 RPM up on the 812. To achieve this, there are titanium conrods, a new aluminium alloy for the pistons, a 3% lighter crankshaft and sliding finger followers, all focused on saving weight and reducing inertia. Interestingly, torque has dropped very slightly compared to both its direct predecessor and the Competizione, with a maximum of 500 pounds-feet now available at 7,250 RPM, although 80% is available from just 2,500 RPM. The less exciting part of this engine, but more critical in a way, is the fact that it is, well, compliant with all the latest emissions regulations, things like EU6E. And what that means on a sort of practical level, I suppose, is that down the line from the new equal length headers, the particulate filter and the catalytic converter both have sort of thicker coatings on them. So they're restricting the breathing of this engine more. With that in mind, the Ion ECU regulates the combustion with a particular eye on the increased back pressure from the new exhaust system. On the intake side, the engine now has variable geometry inlet tracts, and there are new resonators which try to circumvent some of the legislated noise reductions by directing as much of the induction sound as possible into the cabin. It's not just the engine, of course. You really do have to view the powertrain as a whole, and that means the gearbox as well. Up from the old 7-speed dual clutch transmission, we've now got the 8-speed one, which has been in things like 296 as well. And the advantage of that is not only obviously do you get the extra 8th gear right at the top to help with those pesky emissions, but that in itself allows the lower gears to be slightly shorter, 5% shorter. Ferrari says that the shifts are actually 30% quicker than before, which is a feat that's hard to believe possible if you felt an 812 swapping cogs. Imagine trying to notice one person blinking 30% faster than another. Ferrari gearboxes have always been arguably the best, really, in terms of their paddle shifts. There's something so characterful about them. They're so good, but so theatrical. The big carbon paddles and the way that they rev on downshifts, and you can really buzz the limiter. It's so exciting. Something else that's been patented with this engine is something called torque smoothing. So they've just taken out all the rough edges. It's exactly what it sounds like. There are no sort of peaks in it as you accelerate in third and fourth gear. So they want this sort of seamless surge of acceleration. It certainly seems to work. I'm not sure you would know it was there if you didn't know about it. And overall, the performance of this engine, it's absolutely there. 2.9 to 62 and a top speed of over 211 miles an hour, so exactly the same as before actually. What isn't there, of course, is the sound quite. It is just a bit quieter, a bit less animalistic. You can tell the engine itself is there, but the sound isn't quite as raw. It still sounds really good, particularly on the gear shifts.
There's a lovely spike of sound punctuating each high revs change, but overall there is just a bit less volume and edge to the soundtrack, particularly at lower revs. And how something sounds does have an impact.
We should talk about the name really a little bit because, well, I've sort of avoided saying it too much. One thing you should say, you have to call it, I think, by the Italian version, so you can't call it the 12-cylinder because, well, I suspect you may end up with some sort of nagged noggin in your bed if you do that. But you also sort of need to say it with an Italian accent. It's like you need to stand in front of a mirror, perhaps with some dark glasses on in the middle of the day and a particularly sharp suit, just practicing saying 12Cilindri.
So, don't call it the 12-cylinder and definitely don't truncate it to 12C, particularly if you're near Woking. Here's Enzo Ferrari saying it correctly while talking about the importance of the V12 to Ferrari.
Il 12 cilindri resta sempre la macchina originale della Ferrari quando lei pensa che nel 1946 è nato il 12 cilindri 1500 cm3. Quindi tutto il resto è una derivazione del modello originale.
Wonderful clip, isn't it? And the name sounds so good, so natural when he says it. Attempted in a variety of other accents, however, I think you get more variable results.
Scottish, that's okay. 12Cilindri. I think because you roll the R a little bit for Scottish. 12Cilindri, that sounds pretty good, I think.
What I'm getting at is that perception of the name, how cool it is, changes with how you say it.
And that sort of relates to this engine as well, because I think perhaps it doesn't feel quite as rabid, quite as quick because of the sound. It is, the performance is all there, but because the sound is a little softer, you don't feel like it's perhaps quite as unhinged.
But while this latest V12 Ferrari might not assault your ears quite as fiercely, in other ways it's arguably more attention-grabbing than ever.
I want to take a moment to talk about the design and the styling of this car because I think it is a big part of it for various reasons. Regardless of whether you like it or not, it is very striking when you see it out on the road. And it's this mix of, yes, a little bit retro, which we'll come to in a minute, but also very futuristic and sharp. I think some of that comes from these big sort of, they say some monolithic, but essentially very clean design. But principally because of this around the front, which is one of the most sort of retro parts of it, because it harks back to the 365 GTB4, dubbed Daytona by the press back in the day.
As a quick aside, the 1960s Pininfarina designed Daytona wasn't always going to look the way most of us know. The first design, which was far enough along to spawn a couple of prototypes, had much more conventional headlights, like the 365 GT 2+2. But it was this nose that turned up at the Paris Motor Show in 1968, and which clearly inspired Flavio Manzoni and his team over 50 years later.
What this does is take the sort of face away from the car. We're used to seeing sort of something that looks a bit sort of smiley, perhaps with the eyes like the headlights, and you don't get that with this. It, to me, is a bit sort of Daft Punk with the mask. It makes me realise just how futuristic actually the 365 GTB4 was.
Overall, what Ferrari says this car's design does is align it more with the Roma than other models. In other words, it shifts the form-function ratio more towards the former.
Performance isn't perhaps quite the priority it once was with this.
If the outside design is very clean and uncluttered, the inside is rather the opposite.
As you expect, the interior can be trimmed, specced in multiple different ways. These seats are the standard ones in Verde Venaria. Venaria is apparently somewhere in northern Italy. It was a royal palace. But you can also have Sabelts, sort of competition seats, more sort of sporty seats, certainly this, and then sort of deck it out to be a bit more technical rather than GT. We've got 3 screens, obviously the one up here, this big one here for your Apple CarPlay, and then the passengers one up there, which you've become used to with Ferrari.
You can clearly see the 2 zones in the car that have been designed for driver and passenger, but otherwise it is a bit of a jumble. There's a lot going on with different materials and shapes and textures, and for me, it just lacks a bit of cohesion and style.
I do like the steering wheel still. I think Ferrari does this bit better than anyone else. They've been doing it longer than anybody else, and actually to use is great. I love the big carbon paddles behind here, the Manettinos, a joy to use, and the indicators and all the other sort of controls for things like windscreen wipers and lights just work really well and feel sort of, well, they're not on a touchscreen, so that works. The haptics, not a fan of those, never have been, but you've got a shortcut to turn off all the ADAS systems as well, which is always nice. So overall, a bit of a mixed bag with the interior, I think.
There are 2 more bits of the exterior design that I need to mention as well, but they only make themselves known on the move.
Enzo Ferrari famously said that aerodynamics were for people that couldn't build engines. Well, perhaps because Ferrari hasn't been able to build exactly the engine that it might have wanted to, this has got some active aerodynamics.
There's no conventional rear wing on the 12Cilindri. Instead, there are 2 panels on the rear haunches that spring into action when required.
They only work above 37 miles an hour and below 186 miles an hour, in fact. And you can't put them up when you're stationary or anything like that. They work when you brake heavily or in corners, basically when you think you might need them, and they add up to 50 kilos of downforce. Braking has been a big thing with this in terms of the change. So we've got brake-by-wire and ABS Evo, which has been really good on these mixed dry, damp roads.
You can really lean into the left-hand pedal with confidence, pushing the tyres to the limits and even trail braking into bends.
In terms of the chassis and the handling, well, they're saying that the chassis underneath this is still aluminium, is 50% stiffer torsionally. We've also got a 20mm shorter wheelbase, and that in combination with the latest virtual short wheelbase electronics, which is the rear wheel steer basically. And that is slightly different to some others in that it works independently on each rear wheel, which is pretty mind-boggling and clever, but thankfully just feels very natural in terms of how it works. The view out of this is all at once brilliant, that way, out through the windscreen, because you've got those sort of high, sharp cheekbone front arches, which makes it really easy to place and actually makes the car feel wonderfully small. You see it from the outside and it's pretty big and long, and you think, well, that could feel very unwieldy, but it doesn't. However, blind spots over the rear, those sort of 3/4, that is, well, a bit of a problem when you're sort of manoeuvring and perhaps wanting to do a lane change. There's not a lot of vision there. Although these roads are super smooth, as ever, you can feel the brilliant control through the dampers, and we've still got the bumpy road button, of course, to use, which is fantastic in the UK.
The handling is broadly very familiar if you've driven an 812, particularly at the limit, with the Manettino set to race or higher.
The sharpness is still there, obviously from the engine, from the steering, which means you can drive this really hard and just and it gives you that confidence because it's so sharp. Particularly in the wet, I find it's really confidence inspiring. We've got version 8 of side slip control, but you can turn it all off and it still feels really natural.
When you're not pushing it quite so hard, however, I think there is something very slightly softer about the setup compared to the 812.
Just through these bends here, perhaps feels a little like it's just slightly slower on turning, perhaps even as though the rack is slightly slower itself. How does it all come together then? Well, in a slightly, and I do mean very slightly, softer, more GT-like overall package, I think. The handling is still sharp, quick, but there's just perhaps something a little less flighty about it. It's as though because the engine can't sound quite as angry as before, Ferrari's decided to, well, lean into that, I suppose, and actually make the whole car just a little bit more GT-like. I did ask Ferrari if there were any lap times for this around Fiorano, because previously that's always been something of a benchmark, and they said no, they weren't quoting one for this. They did say it was quicker, but they're not quoting it. And I think that sort of says quite a lot, really, for just the fact that this is not being seen as, is not a big step on in performance. So they've changed the character of it very subtly.
To that extent, I'm not sure the front-engine V12 Ferrari has moved forwards exactly. Instead, it's almost as though you could see the 812 Superfast, the Competizione and the 12Cilindri as having trained for different disciplines. Subtly different vibes from the same essential package. I still love it, I still love driving it, and I love that Ferrari has persevered and put huge effort in to preserve the purity. It's just that in some ways, it's travelled without moving.